In 2 Samuel chapter 23, verses 11 and 12, we find a description of the valiant efforts of a man by the name of Shammah, who was King David's servant, who was one of his mighty men. This noble event that is recorded about him was his defense of a piece of farmland. He took his stand and refused to back down, even though he had to fight alone. Well, of course, he was not truly alone, even though the people had fled. The text makes it clear that the Lord brought about a great victory on that day. But Shammah had to be willing to stand his ground and fight. Well, what's interesting about this passage is that there is no indication given as to the location of this plot of ground. There's no mention of who owned it, what city was nearby, or the region in which it was located. The only information that is given about this land, besides what was grown there, was the fact that the Philistines had gathered in that place to fight. Because the enemy was there, that was the place where Shammah took his stand to fight. Well, as we apply this to our lives as Christians today, we first need to remember that we are in the midst of a spiritual war. Paul explained this to the church in Ephesus in this way. He said, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you will be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm." This is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 12 through 13. Here we're told that we are to put on the full armor of God because the ways of God are under attack. This is not a struggle against flesh and blood. As Paul told the brethren in Corinth, we do not war against the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing that raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 through 5. This is a battle between good and evil, a struggle to determine the difference between right and wrong, and a contest between the truth of God and the lies of Satan, and we must be prepared to fight this battle. And as we fight, we must stand our ground. But where do we take our stand? Well, like Shammah, one of David's mighty men, we need to stand up and fight wherever the enemy has gathered to attack. Consider what Paul told the Galatians in Galatians 2, verses 3 through 5. "But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, but it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you." Well, during the time when Paul was writing this letter, there were many who were trying to compel Gentiles to be circumcised in order to follow Christ. Circumcision was a practice from the Old Covenant, and it had been taken out of the way as a religious requirement. Paul told these brethren later in that same epistle, "For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything but faith working through love." Yet some wanted to bind circumcision, so Paul stood his ground. Paul stood up to them and refused to compromise. He took a stand for what was right. Well, friends, we too need to stand our ground. We need to do all that we can to prevent sin and error from infiltrating the church and continuing this decline in the moral standards of our nation and the world. We cannot allow this corruption to continue to take place and to get worse. No, we cannot fight every battle, but we can take a stand where we are against the attacks that come our way. Friends, we want to thank you for joining us for our program today. Please consider these things that we've discussed and have a blessed day.